everyone. This is our 125th Reading Online Sports Economics Seminar, so a little bit of a milestone. And thank you everyone who's presented and everyone who is here with us today. It's always a pleasure to spend Friday afternoons here in this way, and Friday mornings if you're in North America, Friday evenings if you're further to the east of us here in Europe. And today we have Michal Krawczyk. I'm probably pronounced your name wrong, Michal. My apologies for that. From the University of Warsaw, presenting Is Running a Marathon Like Running a Business? Identifying Occupational Differences in Overconfidence Using Long-Distance Running Data. Michal has plenty of time, and I'm not going to spend any more time for his presentation. So, Michal, please do take away your talk.
Yes, many thanks for this invitation. It's a pleasure, and I don't really think I need 90 minutes. Although my talk is all about how we mispredict the time that we need for something. So I'm not sure about that, but feel free to jump in because it's a short, simple paper. So I don't think I will need 90 minutes to cover it. Even though I'll be also briefly referring to some of the older papers that are related. Can you see my slides?
Yep, perfect.
Cool. So this is joint work with Haik Amikanian, who's on the labor market really. So if you on the job market, if you have a place for someone interested in overconfidence, behavioral economics, you can think about him. And Maciek Wilamowski is also at the University of Warsaw, a colleague of mine. Now, my main job really is at the Joint Research Center now, but this work was done while I was still full-time at the University of Warsaw. So this is, like I said, the fourth paper in a series in which we are using long-distance running data to investigate overconfidence. So I'm pretty sure most of you are familiar with the notion. It's an umbrella term, really. There are different types, different flavors of overconfidence, but generally speaking, it's like one of the positivity biases in which people, in some situations, some people, but maybe too many people, seem overly confident that they will succeed, which might have important consequences in various domains, sports included. And it could take the form of overplacement when we overestimate the extent to which we will do well compared to others, aka better than average. Like most people think that they are better than average drivers and stuff like that. But maybe it's not a precise question, but no matter. Then there is over precision. So people overestimating the precision of their knowledge, and a typical task would be give me a 90% interval for some length or for some date. And most people give an overly narrow interval, which doesn't cover the true value sufficiently often, as if they were overestimating the precision of their knowledge. But we are talking about overestimation. So the case in which we are overly optimistic about how we will do compared to some benchmark in some natural units. And these natural units could be seconds or days or years. When we're talking about predicting time, we'll need to complete something. There's this large literature on what is called planning fallacy. So, there's this idea that basically everything takes more time than you would have thought, even if you know about this rule. Even if we look at the Germans, who would, the cliche would be that they know a thing or two about planning. If you look at the Berlin airport, it took a bit longer than expected, also in terms of money, but also in terms of time. But when you look at and by the way, if you have a question, I cannot see you. So if you have a question, just jump in and don't hesitate. And if you look at the literature in a more systematic way, then it's not really that everything takes more time than you would have thought. There are at least two important caveats to that. So first, in experimental tasks that people do in the laboratory within a session of some sort, the time that you actually need to complete this task seems to play a big role. So for very short tasks, people are actually they underestimate their speed, so they are not insufficiently. They are overly pessimistic about the time that it will take them. But for longer, they tend to, for longer tasks, they tend to be overly optimistic, right? And if you look at out of session tasks, which are typically longer, like how much time more do you think you need to complete this paper? And you say, well, about a week. And it can be very, very true that you need a week, but surprise, surprise, there are all sorts of other things that you need to do this week and the next week and the week after, and you end up taking 3 months, or maybe you never complete this paper. So out of session tasks. So what we're gonna trying to be doing in some sense is to have an in-session task in which you focus on the task, but this task is much longer than a typical laboratory task, which only takes minutes, right? And the task is to run a marathon, okay? So, and specifically in this particular paper that I'm presenting, mostly today, we focus on because we have already covered some other topics before. Now we try to focus on the link between overconfidence and occupation. Are different professions different in terms of their typical level of overconfidence as it shows up in our task, which is running and pacing the marathon? And there are at least two reasons why we may be interested in this kind of differences between occupations, between professions. One is that if we understand the systematic differences better, then we can better facilitate, we can more effectively manage overconfidence in organizations, right? So if you have a team, you might want to have someone in the team who will say, hey, this will take more time, right? So you may want to know who this somebody is likely to be, right? But also it can shed light on the process of self-selection to do different professions. So the question is like, there's just a lot of literature on overconfidence in entrepreneurs. So it could be that people become entrepreneurs because they think they are so smart and they can make a lot of money, and most of them end up not making that much money. But the question is, is it really a selection? So people who are prone to this kind of bias are more likely to become entrepreneurs, or maybe it's something in your experience as an entrepreneur that make you overly confident. So if you look at different professions at different career stages, young people, old people, then you can have some better understanding of this. Anyway, our approach is as follows. We take as many amateur marathon runners as we can, and we look at their pacing, basically. And our main measure is based on the time it took them to complete the whole 42 kilometers and the time it took them to complete the first half of it. For some marathons, you have like 5 kilometers splits. Often you don't. This slowdown based on the 21 kilometers split, we have some evidence that it works pretty well compared to more sophisticated or more fine-tuned methods. But anyway, so you just look at the time it took to complete the whole marathon minus 2 times what it took to complete the first half. So if you took an hour and 50 minutes to run the first half, then if you kept the same pace, it would have taken 3 hours and 40 minutes. But often people take more. Maybe they take 3 hours 55 minutes. So the 15 minutes is your slowdown. And you can also say, okay, I look at the relative slowdown. So I divide this 15 minutes by this hour and 50 minutes. So 15 is a lot for some people, is less for other people who took a lot of time to run it anyway. So
Michal,
and yes.
There's a question from Wayne.
Absolutely.
Hi there. I don't want to interrupt, but just to get your ideas down. So if you look at the top marathoners or people who marathon many, many times, how consistent is the pacing throughout? And how good a measure is this of somebody who's a consistent or good runner?
Right. So yes, sorry. An excellent question. So we look at amateurs. We don't look at professionals at all. But as you're going to see in a sec, there is this link that is people who run faster also keep a more constant pace. And it works both at individual level. So if you are able to keep a more even pace, it's better for you, generally speaking, most of the time. But it also works between people. So people who are more experienced and better at it tend to keep a more constant pace, have a lower slowdown. Because indeed it's you know, it's just basically a diminishing marginal effect of effort if you want to spread your effort more or less evenly, right? So that's optimal for you. Of course, in the individual cases, you may happen to slow down a lot because of something that was completely unpredictable, but what we see is that it's very systematic. So this is a picture showing like a million marathon runners. So this is on the horizontal axis is the time of the second half. On the vertical is the time of the first half. So if you look at the diagonal, that's the even pace across the halves, and you see that almost everybody is below the diagonal, which means almost everybody takes more time for the second half than the first. And you also see funny things like these horizontal lines, you know, it's yellow surrounded by blue or reddish surrounded by yellow. So these are people who are trying to make it in 3 hours, but failed, right? And here are people who are trying to make it in 3.5 hours and failed. And you also see, so on this line corresponding to the fixed total time, you see a lot of observations just below them, which means, you know, people are really serious about your targets, right? But these horizontal lines show that often people miss their targets. They think they can make it in 3.5 hours, but they don't, right? And the fact that almost everybody runs the second half slower than the first half is kind of telling, and it's kind of what it kind of tells us, we think, is that people tend to be slightly too optimistic about how fast they can run. They think they can make it in about 3.5 hours, but they really can't. Okay, and you know, the nice thing about it, compared to many other tasks that have been proposed to assess overconfidence, which is like you know, cognitive task like math and stuff, it's kind of slightly more uniform across professions. So for our purpose, you know, if you want to compare accountants to firefighters in a math task, well, it's kind of accountants have done more math tasks in their life, right? But here it's something that everybody's an amateur at, right? In our sample, we have this bunch of people who have their daily jobs, which have, generally speaking, nothing to do with running. So we're kind of like we're giving an even space, so it's neutral in some sense, a level playing field or running track, if you want. And we have an objective measure of success, so you know, you kind of can tell how well somebody did. It's a task that everybody's familiar with, because, you know, you're a runner, you run a marathon, you know what it's about. It's not some completely artificial task that you're exposed to in the lab. But then again, you don't do it too often. You do it maybe once a year. So if you make systematic mistakes, you may still fail to account for that. So your natural tendency to be overconfident may show up, right? And for these reasons, I guess, it has also been used to investigate other psychological effects, but I don't have time to do that. So very briefly, for those of you who don't know these papers, which I suppose is most of you, in this JBDM paper in 2017, which is with which we started, basically, we looked at the marathon runners, and we identified such effects as the effects of gender and the effect of of age. So males, or which most of the time, or at least some of these effects that we see are kind of consistent with effects that are for overconfidence, also present in literature using other methods. So, for instance, gender effect, that males tend to be more confident, but the effect of age is kind of funny, because we see a lot of overconfidence in very young people, which is also what you would expect, but also oldest runners, which might have to do with the fact that you think you can still run a marathon in 3.5 hours, but well, surprise, surprise, you're 5 years older than you were 5 years ago, so maybe you cannot anymore. And we also looked at differences between the countries. So we thought that Asia tends to be more overconfident than other continents, for example. And we see that the Bible Belt, where they believe that God helps them, is more overconfident, stuff like that. It was fun. And we looked at also at the effects of temperature, kind of seeing that people underestimate the effect that adverse conditions have on their performance, right? So if it's 20 degrees, you cannot run as fast as when it's 10 degrees. Yes.
Another question from Wayne.
Sorry to interrupt, but this is quite fascinating. And so I really love the data that you're presenting. Have you seen the Ray Fair papers that look at people's running, and then they do age-adjusted speeds? And so they adjust by age over time.
Yeah.
So it's a cool paper. So I wonder how that would intersect with the age and overconfidence.
Good question. I'm not sure if I'm familiar. If you can put it in chat, I'll be most grateful.
Yes, but I appreciate very much seeing all of this. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, then there was another paper in which we compare different runs, longer runs, shorter runs, more difficult runs, because there is this idea that if the task is difficult, people tend to be more overconfident because they underappreciate that it's a difficult task. So we compared the marathons and the half marathons and the 10 kilometers, and we see that pacing is much better in shorter runs than in longer runs. So in marathons, we have this picture that we have seen already, and in 10 kilometers, people are much closer to, which is like a simpler, easier task. People are closer to optimal pacing, and the half marathon is kind of in between. Also, so this is basically the same thing, but just for split by gender. You see that the gender effect is there clearly in marathons, but not so much in shorter distances. Then we looked also at the faster and slower runs. So some marathons are easier, some marathons are more difficult, and among the marathons, those that happen to be slower also happen to have worse pacing, more relative slowdown that people show, and same for other distances. So again, harder task, more overconfidence, it would seem, and for temperature. So this is a picture for a marathon that we saw before. If it's too warm, people get their pacing wrong. But for half marathons, there is also a very clear pattern, and it's a bit weaker for 10 kilometers, which is not too surprising because, and then generally speaking, the shorter the distance, the less adverse temperature is, as far as I know. I'm sure many of you are much more familiar with this literature than I am, and then there is also something that you referred to, comparing different people. So we see that better runners would tend to pace better, and especially for this is especially strong for half marathons. So which is kind of maybe natural that everybody knows that that a marathon is hard, and everybody and 10K is not so hard to pace, right? But half marathon is surprisingly difficult to pace for inexperienced runners. That's our interpretation. So anyway, this is what, and we have yet another paper, which I'm not going to talk about gender gaps in overconfidence, whether in macho countries the machos are much more macho than women and so on. Anyway, so in this new paper, we not so new anymore, but not published yet. We wanted to look at the differences between professions, about differences between occupations, and there is some theoretical considerations that made us think that it could be possibly interesting, and I don't think we want to go too much into these papers, but there's some literature that makes predictions for the possible differences, why they could be interesting, and there's also suggestions that this kind of differences in overconfidence could be self-perpetuating. Then in some jobs, people tend to, people who got these jobs tend to get confirmed that they are so great, stuff like that. There are not many empirical studies that look at that. There are some, like I said, that suggest that entrepreneurs tend to be more overconfident than non-entrepreneurs, which is kind of understandable, given that when you are an entrepreneur, you take more risk and your payoff depends more on how good you are, whatever it means, right? And there is also some evidence that CEOs or the bosses are, generally speaking, quite overconfident. It could be that it helps you to become, to have a great career if you're a confident type, because people may believe you that you're so great. It could also be that if you have made a lot of money and you have been successful in your professional life, you come to a conclusion that it must be because you're so smart, which may or may not be true, right? So it could be both selection and the effect of your experience. And also for entrepreneurs, there's like selection, initial selection, but there could be also that they selectively drop out at a later stage. There were some isolated studies that were looking at different groups of professionals with mixed results, I guess. One good thing about our study is that we have a lot of different professions we can compare, right? Which is not the case in most of the studies that I'm or in any of the studies that I'm aware of. Okay, so what we do, we take the data from the Warsaw marathons. We focus on this particular event. In previous studies, we also use data from other marathons because we happen to have data, partial data about the profession that people represent, okay? In particular, when people were registering for these editions of the Warsaw Marathon, they could self-select, they could pick, I am a lawyer, or I am an entrepreneur, or I'm a policeman, etc. And then they would be ranked within their profession on top of being ranked overall. Okay, so the list of professions you could choose from was predetermined. So it was on the registration page. It was provided by the organizer of the race, and partly it was determined by the availability of sponsorships, or there was some sponsor of Polish championship of bloggers in marathon running. Okay, and then the organizer would post the ranking list within a job category, like I said. So here is the here is a number of participants that we had. As you can see, it's very not uniform. So in particular, if you happen to be a female blogger, you can easily become like the the champion of Poland. I think you just need to run the marathon in about 3 hours and 45 minutes, and you're the best female blogger because there are not so many of them running. And but in some categories we have relatively like male, so policemen, firemen, etc. There are a lot of them. Okay. But of course, this is only a minority. So actually, most runners did not choose any of these categories. So it's like everybody else. Of course, you're not forced to. You may be a lawyer, but you're not. Maybe you're ashamed of being a lawyer or something, and you don't self-select, or you don't want your name on the list, or whatever, or you miss it, and you're in this group then. Then we thought, okay, given that most people are not categorized, and these categories are kind of haphazard, it's kind of random, we want to try something out on our own. And we thought, okay, we have the names of these people, we have their age category, we have the place where they come from. Let's try to find them. So it was impossible for people with popular names, like if your name is Piotr Kowalski or Michal Krawczyk, for that matter, and you're from Warsaw, there are 1,000 other people who are named Krawczyk in Warsaw, maybe 10,000 other people who are named Krawczyk in Warsaw. So it's difficult to identify. But if you happen to have a less popular name or you come from a small place, then we can try to find you. And that's what we did. So we used all the data we had, which is basically name, year of birth or age category, and place of residence, to find them on Facebook, LinkedIn, Golden Line, whatever it's called, wherever possible, or their website, to establish what kind of job they have. And then we would try to assign this ISCD, whatever it's called, code to every job title that we could find. And here's so for some categories like business and administration professionals, we have a non-trivial number of people, but for other categories, it's very few. It's very time consuming, so we only did it for 1 year, 2019, the most recent year for which we have the data, because we did it exposed, so people can change jobs in the meantime and blah blah blah, move to another place. We were very conservative, so if there were some doubts whether this is the same person, we would assume it's not the same person, right? And so some prominent groups that were commonly represented is entrepreneurs, managers, and IT professionals. Okay, so now that we knew something about the job that people were doing, we let it enter the regression models. So we run both regressions in which the dependent variable is slowed down and the relative slowed down, and we had the 21 kilometers split, so basically a measure of how fast you are. We had the gender, we had the age, and we had some dummies for like whether the dummies for the year in which it was run. So this is run for all the years. So we use these categories that were assigned by the organizers, right? So we for some we only show the rows in which we have some stars, because otherwise it wouldn't fit in the slides. So for some groups we have an effect. People in sales are slightly more overconfident than other people, and journalists and lawyers and educators are slightly less overconfident. Students are a bit more overconfident than other professions. Then we also looked at the interaction with age, which was kind of interesting from our perspective, because I told you about this kind of question whether overconfident professionals are born or made. So when you look at age, one thing you find is that young policemen and firefighters is a group that is particularly overconfident. Maybe that's how they select, but then over time you learn that you're not a god, and you fail in some situations. So you know, and of course, not surprisingly, we get the results that we knew before, that for example, that males are much more overconfident than females. This is not surprising, even if we control for all sorts of other things. And we also have some results for the 2019 where we can use our measures, and again, people in sales tend to be more overconfident, and entrepreneurs are slightly more overconfident. So yeah, there is only so much we can do because the number of observations is limited, especially for some sales, right? So this is what we have. So to summarize, our method of identifying overconfidence can be applied to investigating differences between professions, but this method has its limitations. It's really time-consuming, and this results in reduced sample size, so we don't have as much statistical power as we would want to have. We observe some results that are quite intuitive, such as greater overconfidence of salesmen and entrepreneurs and young uniformed officers, which kind of tell you that selection can play a role. The three groups that for which we find that they are relatively underconfident, that we find are doctors and lawyers and bankers, and we kind of have an exposed explanation that these are kind of professions in which you have these cases in which you should succeed. So you have this patient, and he or she should recover, but does not, right? So there are cases in which you should succeed, you don't, and you get explicit feedback about that. Or you should win this case, but you don't, you get explicit feedback about your performance. Of course, it's not just your performance, but you have some explicit measure of your success, and it can be negative. So that may be something that is curbing this overconfidence, that helps you learn that you may not be as good as you think you are. So yeah, again, bad planning. It was much faster than it should have been, but I'm happy to take whatever questions you might have, suggestions. It's a fun type of data set to work with. We're kind of done with that, I guess, after 4 papers, but if you have great suggestions, then you can follow them, or you can make them to me.
Great, thank you very much, Michal. Could you unshare your screen?
Absolutely.
Just because it gives me a big picture of myself, which is not a little bit off-putting. Thank you. I don't know, is that overconfident or underconfident to have finished sooner than you expected?
Yeah, good question. It's like whether if there are few questions, it's never clear whether the presentation was clear or so uninteresting that everybody, especially online, everybody started doing other things.
Yeah,
anyway.
well, we've got 2 questions off the bat. So the first one is from Ian Gregory Smith.
So I was wondering, so you keep talking about overconfidence. Is that something that's very distinct from risk taking? So in economics, we normally think about people being risk averse or less risk averse. And I guess if you're going out hard, then are you not just taking a risk? You know, there is some chance you're going to blow up, but you know, to maximize the possibility of success, you're going to go out hard, because if you go out slow, you've had it. Like, you're not going to achieve your goal. So Is it overconfident to go out hard, or is it just you're accepting a risk?
Excellent question, and sometimes we cannot distinguish the two. Also, the like demographic correlates tend to be similar. For instance, there's some evidence that males tend to be more risk-taking, but conceptually it is different, and we have some evidence that at least partly the effects we're observing are about overconfidence, not about willingness to take risk. The chief bit of evidence, which I should have mentioned, so thanks for giving me the opportunity to do that, is that we find very high correlation between the error in explicit estimate that people make and the pacing. So so the typical situation is that somebody tells us or tells the organizer, I think I can make it in 3.5 hours. She starts running and maybe makes it to more or less from 20 kilometers to 30 kilometers, keeping this pace that would have made her time close to what she was predicting. But then she goes much slower in the last 10 or 15 kilometers. So a strong correlation. So, you know, the error in estimate that you make, you're not stating your goal, you're stating your estimate, your prediction, your forecast. I think I can make it in 3.5 hours. If that's off, then, you know, it's nothing to do with risk aversion, right? It's or risk seeking. It's about what you predict. So it's about your inability to predict correctly, and it correlates very, very highly with this slowdown, which kind of tells us that the slowdown is at least partly about confidence. Although risk-taking, like you pointed out, can play a role, and it seems that to a small extent, the fact that males tend to pace worse is partly because they are ambitious and risk-taking, and they say, I really want to make it in 3.5 hours. If I fail, I don't care. Maybe it will be much slower, but I really want to do it, and they take the risk of running the first half, so that they have a chance to make it in 3.5 hours, even if they are aware that that it's unlikely.
Yeah.
Thanks, Ian. Next question from Wayne.
Yeah, so since you've got the data for so many years, is it possible to look at the last couple of years and then look to see which of them are experienced marathon runners? So if you looked at 2018, 2019, and then you were to indicate the extent to which people have run marathons, run the Warsaw Marathon before, is that informative as opposed to somebody who might be well, and in your entire data set, how many repeat runners are there as opposed to people who do it a single time? That's one question. And then there's just a general question about why do people run marathons? What are people's goals in running marathons? And are people just happy to say, I ran a marathon? You know, to the extent that they're experienced and they've run a marathon before, then, and you can document at least once, are those people more or less likely, you know, to be able to keep a pace? Or is this people who just want to have the cool experience of having run a marathon? And then whatever about the overconfidence stuff, maybe, you know, I don't know, like for an experienced person as opposed to a novice, and thinking about, you know, overconfidence between those. And I suppose lastly, there's, did you at all look at breaking the race up instead of halves into other segments? And if that's interesting at all?
Right, excellent questions. So concerning the experience, we have tackled this question a couple of times. The problem is that, you know, people take part in marathons in many different cities. And the fact that somebody maybe hasn't participated in the Warsaw Marathon in the last 5 years doesn't mean that he's not a super experienced marathon runner, because he might have taken part in Lisbon or Berlin or wherever. And so it's not such a good proxy. Occasionally also it's difficult to actually identify the same person because people may have the same names, etc. Women may get married and change their name, etc. So yeah, we try to play with that, but we don't. We don't have an excellent data set for that. And yeah, absolutely, there are people who don't just want to take part in a marathon. They want to achieve a specific goal. There's this nice paper in management science, I think, which looks specifically at goal setting and this kind of. We also saw it in the picture that there are many more people who make it in 4 hours as opposed to people who make it just a bit more than 4 hours, which kind of tells you that there are people who really care about the time. If that answers the question. But yeah, we don't have excellent data to tell at individual level what your goal is. And people did look at this other finer splits. We didn't look at this. My take on it is that it doesn't buy you that much. This is the finer splits. It kind of tells a similar story, I guess. But I didn't work with this kind of data myself. But
great, thanks, Wayne. Next is Daniele.
Hi, Michal. Super interesting. So my question, you characterize these as amateur runners. And running a marathon is not something you just wake up in the morning and say, "Oh, I'll just go run a marathon." Like you need to train, for several months to get this. And in a sense, these are pretty experienced runners because at the very least they've trained for a few months to prepare for the marathon. So I mean that's just sort of one comment, and the other comment, I was wondering, you have a selection here between the bankers, lawyers, entrepreneurs who are marathon runners versus those that aren't, and right. I was wondering if there's any way of characterizing, maybe run a survey with the marathon runners and those that don't run marathon, or maybe just run shorter distances, and are there differences in sort of lab measures of risk-taking, overconfidence, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, excellent suggestion. I'm not aware of a very good data set that would shed much light on it. There's some evidence, of course, that marathon runners are different from non-runners, but mostly among the dimensions that could partly be captured in our data. So marathon runners tend to be richer, better educated, and from bigger cities than non-runners, but it kind of correlates with also with profession, I guess. But yeah, I mean, it could well be that it's not a good representation in terms of feature traits such as overconfidence. On the other hand, you would have also for gender, right? There is this question whether the selection patterns are same for men and women. But unless you have a great theory, very convincing, that would tell you that the selection is different for entrepreneur to become a runner is very different from one profession than the other, or from one gender from the other. It may be, but it's not obvious why the selection patterns should be very, very different.
Great. Thanks, Daniele. And Weisha, next question.
Yeah, I have two questions. So the first one is, I was wondering about what might be the relationship between the overconfidence and the slowdown. So what is the mechanism behind this relationship? Is it because overconfidence is based on preparation, the level of preparation, or is it when overconfidence is not it is not really explained by the level of preparation? So it's like someone is overconfident, that's why they are not preparing as much, and that results to the slowdown. That could be one possibility. And the other thing is that, well, I mean, it's basically the mirror image of that someone is not overconfident, that's why they are preparing more, and that's why they are not slowing down.
Yeah, right.
So that's, I mean, if there are any studies which looks at this, like what is the mechanism? or if you found something regarding that. And the second question is, well, I mean, maybe I missed something in your slides. Did you find any interaction effect between these different professions and gender? I mean, you presented something regarding age.
Yeah. We also looked at interactions with gender, but for some professions we have very few women, so we don't have much power to tell. But we didn't find significant interactions with gender. Concerning the mechanism, we don't know, in this sample, we don't know anything about their pattern of preparation. And it's an excellent suggestion that one mechanism could be that if you're too confident, then you don't spend enough time preparing. We have run some surveys, like questionnaires with participants of marathons, but the sample wasn't quite as large as I would have wanted. So I don't have very good data on that. But in either case, I guess if you start and run the first half in 1 hour 50 minutes, then it basically means you think you can make it, or at least you want to make it in 3:40, right? So in some sense, we are measuring the overconfidence in terms of their beliefs about their abilities when they are starting, right? So you may be aware that you should be aware that you have not practiced enough if you have not practiced enough. At this stage, when you're to start the marathon, you should adjust to your level of preparation. If you cannot make it in 3:40, you have to run a bit slower.
Yeah, but that can also help you distinguish between, like what you were mentioning, whether overconfident people are born, like is it part of nature, or it's like developed based on certain other things. So if I am overconfident based on some practice that I have had, or some self-assessment of myself, then that's one thing. And if I am overconfident by nature, then I mean, distinguishing between the two might be.
No, right. So it's very interesting, but it probably would have to look at a very different type of data, like maybe data from the apps that people use to train and stuff like that.
That's true. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Anwisha. Bernd is next.
I cannot
You're
hear
on
you.
mute, Bernd. Still muted.
Still muted.
I can't unmute you.
Now?
There you go.
Okay. So I'm still a bit struggling with your dependent variable. You measure the slowdown by comparing the speed in the first and the second half of the marathon. But that slowdown can be due to hitting the wall after 35 kilometers and experiencing a massive slowdown shortly before the finish line. And it can be due to a gradual slowdown that starts at 20 kilometers already. How can you distinguish between these two different types of slowdown? You could use 5 kilometer interval times to better control for that. And that data should be available, right?
Not for this marathon. For some marathons, there's data by 5 kilometer split. Like I said, in the papers that I saw, the analysis based on, because in the last 5 years, other people have also used the same method. As far as I could see, the conclusions that, like for instance, demographic effect that you find are kind of similar, no matter whether you use 21 kilometer split or some finer splits. What you're saying is totally right, but in either case, no matter whether you start slowing down when it's on the 20th kilometer or the 35th, a good reason for you slowing down is that you started too fast, which is a signal of you being too confident about your abilities. So in this sense, yes, it's a heterogeneity of effects, but they may all point at overconfidence.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Bernd. Wayne, your hand is still up. Do you have another question to ask?
Yes. Yeah, I guess, one thing that's really interesting about this domain is that it presumably is a domain in which one needs, many months ahead of time to prepare. And then the event itself is quite an extended event. So that's just, it's a really nice domain to be looking at this question. I realize there's other papers that have done this as well, but it does seem as though if there's some way to get like club training data, and then match that to the marathon, it would just be really interesting to look at this domain. I mean, these are people who are, dedicated to exercise and fitness. They're people who are patient, who do long distance running. It's all interesting in terms of just the people who select into an activity like that, and then who engage in it, and to think about these, circumstances and what their expectations are. They went in with some goal. I guess. So what is the breakdown that you have in terms of times throughout the event?
What do you mean?
So you just have a halfway point.
In this marathon, just midpoint. Yeah, it's a 21 kilometer split.
Okay,
That's all I have. Yes, but yeah.
Can I add something?
Yeah, sure.
Can I add an argument to Wayne's question? A few months ago, I've seen a paper where somebody combined training data shared on a website called Strava with the performance of these individuals in the London Marathon, I think. But what makes this paper a bit difficult, let's say, to believe, is that the average training reported by people on Strava is 80 kilometers per week. And 80 kilometers is massive. That means you have to run virtually every day. So you have a double self-selection into marathons and then into sharing your training data on Strava. So the data that is accessible, to answer your question, is clearly not representative for the population of marathon runners.
Yeah. No, but also like what Daniele was saying, the fact that these people are not, I mean, it's not just something that you do like that. It's actually a massive effort. It's kind of makes the fact that, vast majority of people come up as overconfident, it makes this result even more interesting, right? Because you would think that these people know better, because you don't want to ruin your months of preparation and your massive effort with bad pacing. So you should really think carefully about it. So I guess it kind of makes it interesting in some sense. The main result that people still start too fast.
Although I don't know. I mean, from like a Bayesian updating point of view, how many marathons does a person run a year? For somebody who does that, are you running twice a year?
One or two, yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, if you're a tennis player, you're getting Bayesian updating on a regular basis. You're getting a reality check. You understand how well you are, what your performance levels are, what you're capable of, and you can't deny it. But for a marathon runner, if you're running twice a year, I don't know. You've practiced really well this season, you thought. Interesting to think about how for a twice a year kind of activity with the stakes so high. And I don't know. Anyway, so it's just interesting to think about this particular domain. It's fascinating, it's great data. It's also very particular, which can map onto a lot of occupations and a lot of other things in life that are really relevant.
No, that's a great point. Although I'm not sure if it's impossible to deny. I think that I perform when I play volleyball. I almost always perform below my normal level. It's it feels that my normal level is higher, but it's just a bad day or a particularly strong opponent or particularly bad setting on part of my team. So, but the good thing about marathon running, I guess, is that it's really individual, right? So, you know, it's basically always the same task. Okay, it's a bit warmer, a bit colder, but it's just you and the 42K you have to cover. And whereas in tennis, you know, it could be other things like how well the opponent is playing mostly. So in some sense, the feedback that you're getting in this individual sports may be kind of cleaner, maybe.
I agree with the individual sports. Yes, I do think that since marathon running, when you have more advanced, technology to help you, you just, you put in your pace. You keep on pace. Every kilometer or mile, you get a feedback about if you're on pace or below pace. There was a point in time in which that wouldn't have been true of marathoners. It would have been more difficult or complicated. People on the side every mile trying to give you some information. So that does make it easier. And of course, it'd be totally cool to know what everybody's expectations were before they entered the race, and how they actually performed. But,
You attribute the entire slowdown in the second half to, let's say, a mental response to wrong pacing. But what about potential physiological explanations? So your suggestion is it's all about the mental disposition of runners who started out too fast. Some people may respond more and others less to a deteriorating physical situation.
Sure. Absolutely, and it certainly plays a role, but I think it's largely orthogonal to occupation, orthogonal to profession.
Out of interest, Michal, since you find essentially everybody's overconfident, does that suggest that maybe the measure could be tweaked a bit? I mean, I don't know, wouldn't it be the case that people get a bit tired after 21 kilometers and therefore it's natural that the second half is a bit slower? And maybe you take the kind of the median overconfidence or the difference between first and second half times and use that instead?
Yeah. So if I say that 80% or 90% are overconfident, is a kind of like a shorthand for. I cannot objectively say they're overconfident, but what seems to be the case is that roughly equal pace is roughly optimal. So in this sense, and it's natural that you get tired when you're running, but you should know that, right? Before you start. If you have been preparing for months and paid money and maybe traveled 1,000 kilometers to get to the place, you should know that you will get tired by running, and you should include it in your planning.
Another question that sprung to mind, you might have mentioned in your talk, presumably folk don't finish the race. Do you include those in your data set, or do you just exclude them because they've got as?
It's only a few percent. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. It's just a very small part of people. You can, I think you typically have like 5.5 or 6 hours or something like that, which means basically walking from some point is also fine.
Right,
so
yeah.
Almost everybody finishes 95, 98% in this range.
Yeah. Daniele.
I forgot what I wanted to say. I'm sorry, I'll pass the question.
Any other questions and comments?
So I had a thought about the optimal pacing. So I think it's being shown that the optimal pacing for elite runners is to pace evenly or maybe with just a slight negative split. But that's them running to their absolute ability. Whereas with most of us, what we're trying to do is we're just trying to get the best time we can. And if we went for, I could run at a pace where I know I'm going to sustain that. So I could run at 6 kilometers an hour for what is it, 42 kilometers. But that would give me a very slow time at the end. So I wouldn't be blowing up on the finish line. I'd be blowing up, 100 kilometers later. Whereas what I want to do is blow up one step after the line if I want the fastest time possible. So within that, and given that I don't know where that marker is, don't I have to assume some probability of blowing up ahead of time? And then, if everyone does that, you're going to see a slowdown. And it's not because I'm overconfident. It's just I'm trying to do the best thing I can. And with some probability, I am going to blow up a little bit too soon.
No, right. It has to do with what your first question was about, the willingness to take the risk. Yes, it's part of the story. I'm not claiming it's all about overconfidence. It's part of the story, and we have some evidence that like correlation with forecast errors that shows that it's part of the story. But I'm not saying.
You say the same thing with underconfidence. So if I'm speeding up, is that underconfidence? Can you see? So if I run the second half faster,
so if you're really speeding up, it means you may have started speeding a bit sooner, right? Generally speaking.
So I wonder if you can see the same patterns in underconfidence.
We don't have many observations because this negative split is just rare, right? So
okay.
I mean, the good thing about this data is that you can get large samples. So if you're interested in the entire population, even if only 10% have the second half faster, it can still be 100,000 observations easily. Yeah.
Great. Thanks.
Okay.
Ian.
I have my question. So I think this is a little bit related to what Ian was suggesting. I think that I know that I have a running app and I follow this sort of training program, and the coach tells us, you should aim for a negative split. So a negative split means that you go, and I'm training just for a 5K. Okay, so don't. So it's something that I think runners know that they should either evenly pace themselves or aim for negative splits. I mean, it's something, it seems like a recommendation that is sort of out there among coaches, and it's probably in magazines and all these resources out there. So I mean, that's one point, and I think that this related to Bernard's question about hitting the wall. I think that you said that there are these other some data there where you have these intermediate splits, and I think it sounds like it could be possible to find sort of some evidence of hitting the wall. So really massive slowdowns at kilometer 30, 35 versus just like a gradual slowdown. And I just wonder if that would help in some of these things.
Right. It should be possible with these finer splits. The question is, if you have this kind of data, what do you exactly conclude? I mean, would slowing down more dramatically at the 35th kilometer is less or more indicative of being overconfident, overestimating your abilities?
I think
it's not so obvious, right?
No, but it goes a little bit to the point that Ian was making, that my optimal is to sort of blow up one step after the finish line, and where exactly do I sort of hit the wall? Is I would expect the overconfidence to see more of this, hitting the wall, that look, I just can't make it anymore behind the 30th or 35th kilometer, versus going from 6 minutes per mile to 7 minutes per mile. That kind of a slow, gradual deterioration in pace. That's and maybe it is pushing it a bit, but it could be sort of one way that to support that the overconfidence claim.
So I'm wondering about just the terminology. So when you're searching for occupations, how common is it for people to write entrepreneur? I mean, what were you finding for the entrepreneurial category?
So they don't necessarily call themselves explicitly entrepreneur, but if we find a website which shows that you're a owner of a small business, then we call you entrepreneur. So this was our interpretation, which was done blindly in a sense that the rater didn't know the marathon data, right? So when judging whether someone was an entrepreneur or not, our research assistant did not know what split this person had, etc. But of course there is some subjectivity to this rating or categorization, I should say, I suppose. But yeah, it could be. It's to some extent subjective, but yeah, often we didn't have much doubt, I guess.
And certainly what I wonder about the overconfidence of people referring to themselves as entrepreneurs, and whatever they're doing and whatever that amounts to in terms of an occupation and such. But yeah.
Great. Well, I think at that point, it's probably good to wrap up. Thank you very much, Michal, for a really interesting talk, for a really interesting discussion. I've only ever run half marathons, but I always tend to do a positive split. My own take on that is that I kind of want to bank a time, and I figure if I've got there that bit sooner, I've somehow banked it because I won't tail off that much in the second half. But that might be a half marathon strategy that's okay and would be a disaster in a full marathon. But thanks, everyone. A really, really interesting discussion. Next week, we're back with Babak Samek, who's going to present on basketball inside the NBA bubble, how black players perform better without fans. So have a great weekend, everyone. And I look forward to seeing many of you again next week.
Many thanks.
Cheers.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.